Hi, I want to let you all know how much I enjoyed our introduction to mindfulness last night. Greg, Randy, Mendy, John, Diana, Brian, Ed, Alice, Alan, Rob, Dar. It was a treat to get to spend time together exploring and discussing some of the basic foundational elements of a mindfulness practice. Yesterday afforded us an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit, for me to get a sense of what it is that brought you into that room, where your interests in mindfulness reside, and to be able to share with you a little bit about what mindfulness is, a little bit about the neuroscience that's finding mindfulness practices to have a tractable, measurable benefit and effect on the structure and function of the brain in areas that are important to us, both in the work that we do professionally and the lives that we lead. I wanted to take a few moments to just recap briefly what it is that we covered, offer you perhaps a short guided practice so that the little bit of time we spent together and the little bit of time we spent practicing might come to offer you a more fuller opportunity to bring mindfulness into your life after the workshop is over, and while the sessions 2 and sessions 3, if you're participating in them, will be a larger, if you will, immersion in the practicing of mindfulness. We won't have the opportunity in that larger group setting to get to know one another as well, but that's why it is that this introductory session was geared to offer us that opportunity to connect in that way. Sessions 2 and sessions 3 will zero more in on the practicing of mindfulness, some demonstrations to bring the insights to life, and to create a pathway or a groundwork to bring mindfulness more fully into our lives, again, personally and professionally. And some wonderful observations were made yesterday about the challenge of doing just that, the opportunity that it presents. Some wonderful insights were offered into the idea that the practicing by itself in a room that's quiet is one thing, but bringing it into our lives and the work that we do, that is perhaps another challenge, and yet of the value of the practice in the more, if you will, controlled and the more predictable environment that we can create for ourselves so that we become more skilled in the cultivation of present moment mindful awareness, so that we can more naturally and spontaneously bring it into the rest of our day, if you will. So a couple of the highlights, just the key reminders to take with you and to reinforce, and then a short mindfulness practice. So 1, this mind wanders, and that is a natural and in many ways helpful aspect of the nature of our the activity of the mind. But because the mind wanders, we can't expect that if we're going to lower or close our eyes and bring our attention to an object, it's going to stop wandering. And in fact, it's the wandering when we bring an awareness to it that perhaps offers that very important neuroplastic change that we bring to our brain. And this is called self-directed neuroplasticity. And so it's the very wandering itself that's the that wherein the opportunity lies. So when you practice and you notice a busy mind, there is the one attitude which is, this busyness is getting in the way. But there's also the equally and perhaps more profoundly rich insight, here the opportunity resides. Because we live in a time and we live in a culture for which there is so much distractibility. And we're learning that the internet and just the ways in which the busyness of our worlds and the ways that society imposes on us a 24/7 necessity to be everywhere for everyone all the time can in fact perhaps facilitate and exacerbate that distractibility to which the mindfulness practice is directly oriented. So the mind wanders. It wanders as much as, and from day to day probably in very different ways, 50% of the time. We're not necessarily aware that it's wandering, and as we'll explore in sessions 2 and 3, the fact that it's wandering and we're not aware that it's wandering is perhaps where we find ourselves moving into emotional states that aren't so comfortable and engaging in conduct and making decisions that aren't necessarily in alignment with our true intentions, if you will. If we could cultivate and carry that present moment awareness, we'd be less likely to get lost in the emotional and intellectual terrain that isn't as satisfying as we'd like it to be. So the mind wanders. We're not often aware that it's wandering. That in many ways is a formula for, or the ingredients for, a less satisfying way of being present and oriented towards the work we're doing and the people with whom we're interacting. That the mood changes as a result of the quality of attentiveness that we're able to bring moment by moment, and that the mindfulness practice is really one that's oriented around placing our attention on an object. When we notice our mind wandering, returning to an object, and in that one piece of a mindfulness practice, cultivating a greater capacity to focus, to pay attention, to notice when the mind is wandering, and to be able to more skillfully make a decision of what to do when we realize the mind is wandering. Sometimes, as we'll learn in another session, the mind wanders and we get an idea or an insight, and it's not about bringing our attention back, but it's about skillfully and meaningfully attending to that insight. But oftentimes, the mind wanders into past and future in an ever-present, if you will, effort to make sure we're safe in environments in which we're, for the most part, perfectly safe. And that movement of the mind really gets in the way. And so the mindfulness practice is one in which we place our attention on an object. The object that we chose was either the breath or the body. We could say that the breath and the body know only this moment. And so when we bring our mind, if you will, into a more formal connection with the body, we find ourselves more fully present. And then when the mind wanders, it's wandering from an object, the breath or the body. We realize it's wandering because we've placed it intentionally on an object. And therefore we have the opportunity to realize that it's departed from that object and to bring our attention back. Again and again and again. And as was noted yesterday, and the idea that as is the nature of the mind, so too is the nature of the sky, of weather conditions, of the ocean, the activity of the ocean, and there's being on the shore or being inside, if you will, in the midst of a lot of tumult, and there's being lost in the midst of the tumult. How can we realize the tumult? And rather than getting lost and caught in it, cultivate a different relationship to it. So that what's happening doesn't have to change. No one has to change. The circumstances don't have to change for us to be okay in their midst. And then by finding a way of being a little bit more okay in the midst of it all, we might actually find ourselves so much more effective at being able to bring about the change and the conditions that we wish moving forward.